In December of 2010, archaeologist Dr. Tanya Faberson was leading excavations at the site where two homes once stood in Davis Bottom. A new roadway planned for construction would soon cut through this small working-class neighborhood in Lexington, Kentucky. Here, Faberson's team discovered one of the most important features for historic archaeologists, an intact privy.
Hey guys, I need somebody to come over here. I've got some cloth fragments I want you to...
So what we've got here, we have these trash layers. Here's fill, where somebody dumped more dirt. You see here where you have these dumping episodes of, you know, various 20th century trash, lots of cinders, pieces of coal where you know what they were using as a fuel source. Here's a thimble you can see that tells us about, you know, sewing that was going on. We have lots of buttons. And then this very thick fill layer with topsy-turvy bottles is when you start encountering the actual night soil. When they decided to stop using this as a privy, they started dumping their trash in it. And so this actually can give us good dates on the utilization of the privy and when they decided to just use it as a trash pit. So in that way, it actually becomes two features in one. It's really an invaluable aspect of the archaeology and the things that we've been trying to accomplish with our research here in this neighborhood.
Davis Bottom is located about a half-mile southwest of downtown Lexington. Established in the 1860s, this neighborhood was home for thousands of European, African-American, and Appalachian families who moved to Lexington during several waves of migration.
I consider it almost like its own little village, per se, because of the connectedness between the people here, and there are many families, extended families who live here, very close-knit, family-oriented, supportive of each other.
After decades of political and legal battles, a large portion of Davis Bottom is being demolished to make way for the Newtown Pike extension. Davis Bottom is one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Fayette County. But despite economic hardships, residents made this tight-knit enclave a safe, strong, and racially diverse neighborhood for almost 150 years. In order to reduce the impact of construction, residents, community leaders, and government officials have developed several programs designed to retain community cohesion. This includes temporary homes and a land trust. In addition, scholars have been working with residents to preserve the history of Davis Bottom. There are few written accounts. Therefore, every document, family photograph, and living memory gathered from this research provides valuable insights about life in this urban neighborhood.
Davis Bottom had a unique gift. It's a strange kind of gift, but it was a gift that everybody was in the same situation. In current terms, not every income, but an average income is probably about $10,000 a year. And when you're in that situation, you have to depend upon each other. Yesterday, I didn't think my car was going to start because the battery was dead. If I'm living in Davis Bottom, I don't call AAA, I call Uncle Ray to come start my car. And so they have to be connected. There has to be that bond. And I think in some ways, Davis Bottom has been on the leading edge of America and nobody ever knew it, because it has been a diverse community almost since day one.
The history of Davis Bottom is full of fascinating figures. A founder who was an early civil rights leader, a Union soldier who became a community leader, and an artist who developed into one of the most important sculptors and professors of his era. Above all else, Davis Bottom is the story of laborers, servants, railwaymen, tobacco workers, clergy, and cooks. The people who helped make Lexington the commercial heart of the bluegrass region. It's the story of grandparents, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, ordinary families who built an extraordinary neighborhood as part of the Kentucky experience.
This program is made possible with support from the Federal Highway Administration, the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, the Kentucky Heritage Council, and the Kentucky Archaeological Survey.
After the Civil War, thousands of newly freed African Americans left rural areas for cities such as Lexington in search of jobs, security, and opportunity. From 1860 to 1870, Lexington's black population more than doubled, from about 3,000 to 7,000. But housing was in short supply. Only a few property owners would sell or rent homes to blacks. Therefore, most African Americans settled into urban enclaves, such as Brucetown, Kincaidtown, Goodloetown, Pralltown, and Davis Bottom. Close to downtown, these neighborhoods were located near factories, railroads, stockyards, and in swampy, disease-prone areas known as bottomland.
Bottomland is land that is low-lying, easily flooded, and is unsuitable for use for agriculture and for what we would call an estate building. But it was perfectly good to subdivide and to sell these lots to the newly freed African American or any immigrant family. Because we find in the Davis Bottom area, not only did we have African American families, but we also had white families.
Before development, Davis Bottom contained a creek, marshlands, pastures, a coal yard, and 2 quarries. A railroad line ran along the northern ridge. The southern ridge held the remnants of a Civil War fort. Fort Clay was one of 2 fortifications built in Lexington by the Union Army to defend against Confederate attacks. In 1865, William Willard Davis bought and subdivided 43 narrow lots in the valley that now carries his name. Willard Davis was an attorney, a Republican politician, and a staunch advocate for civil rights. He was also a land speculator. Davis was one of several Republicans who developed neighborhoods for African Americans in Lexington after the Civil War. National politics played an important role in the early history of Davis Bottom. On July 4th of 1867, a crowd of 10,000 people, mostly African Americans, gathered for a day of picnics, music, and speeches in a wood about a mile south of Lexington. It was one of the largest civil rights gatherings held in Kentucky during the period of Reconstruction. Willard Davis was a keynote speaker, and one of the first residents of Davis Bottom was surely there. Robert Elijah Hathaway, a Union Army veteran, was a founding member of the Kentucky State Benevolent Association, which helped organize the event. According to the Cincinnati Commercial, the immense crowd stood for hours, quietly listening to speeches from leading civil rights advocates, Reverend John Fee, Judge Goodloe, General Brisbane, Reverend Graham, and Willard Davis. After supper, Davis spoke about the plight of blacks in Kentucky. He decried state laws that prohibited African Americans from testifying in state courts and from voting. This unprecedented gathering was sparsely covered in local newspapers, but the Cincinnati Commercial published a detailed description of the event, including the text of all of the speeches. 9 days later, Charles Sumner carried a copy of the Cincinnati Commercial to a debate in the U.S. Senate over funding for the Third Reconstruction Act. One of a series of Reconstruction measures, the legislation would place Confederate states under military rule to enforce federal laws on basic civil rights. The debate turned into a heated argument between Senator Sumner of Massachusetts and Senator Garrett Davis of Kentucky. Sumner was a leader of the radical Republicans who sought strict Reconstruction measures. Garrett Davis, a member of the minority Democratic Party, favored more lenient legislation. Davis accused Sumner of secretly lobbying to add Kentucky, which stayed with the Union, to the list of Confederate states targeted for federal Reconstruction. Davis also charged that stories from congressmen of wrongs and crimes committed in Southern states against blacks and Union men were the greatest fictions of this day. In response, Sumner read excerpts from the speeches delivered on the 4th of July in Lexington. He cited speech after speech describing the systemic oppression of blacks in Kentucky. Specifically, Sumner quoted the words of Willard Davis.
The right to act for yourself, or to say who shall act for you, is higher than all human law, and no state can deprive a freeman of this right and be Republican in fact. Willard Davis, 1867.
The U.S. Congress easily passed the Third Reconstruction Act on July 19, 1867. Kentucky remained exempt. But the debate between Senators Charles Sumner and Garrett Davis brought national attention to the social and political conditions for African Americans living in Kentucky. The 4th of July gathering in Lexington was a landmark event for civil rights in Kentucky. Speeches presented that day reverberated all the way to the U.S. Senate. And there, at the forefront, were two men with ties to Davis Bottom: Willard Davis, the neighborhood's namesake, and Robert Elijah Hathaway, who just 3 years earlier had been enslaved, the property of U.S. Senator Garrett Davis. There are few archival records about daily life for the first generation of residents in Davis Bottom, but nearly everyone leaves a faint paper trail.
Many times what's missing from working class communities in the archival record are personal accounts, diaries, things that are common when you're dealing with large, wealthy farm owners, things like that. So you have to go to civic records like deeds, city directories, and also census records are very important. They show a lot of information. Those kinds of information reveal occupation, race, marital status. Sometimes you'll get things like income level, whether they own property. It really gives a pretty detailed account of someone's life that you would not have otherwise.
Historic newspapers are another valuable source of information.
Oh, I get very, very excited when I find that there isn't a written account of any one working person's life. When you start compiling those tidbits of information, you kind of get a picture of who this person was.
Some of the first residents of Davis Bottom were Union Army veterans. U.S. colored troops often used their Army pay to buy or rent property after the Civil War. One such soldier was Robert Elijah Hathaway. Hathaway enlisted with the 100th USCT Infantry at Camp Nelson on June 6, 1864. The 100th Infantry guarded the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad and fought in several campaigns. During the Battle of Nashville, 128 soldiers from Hathaway's unit were either killed or wounded.
Robert Elijah is discharged from his unit in December 1865. He's discharged in Nashville, Tennessee, but he makes his way back home, as most of the soldiers did. And he comes to Lexington to live with Isham and his mother.
Robert Hathaway, his stepfather Isham, and another relative likely pooled their Army pay to buy a homestead on West Pine Street on the North Ridge of Davis Bottom.
The property stayed in the Hathaway estate from 1865 to 2008, when it was transferred to our museum for care and development for the Memorial Park. That in itself is a record. It's a treasure. It's a legacy that we build on.
By 1880, the population of Davis Bottom had grown to 387 residents, according to U.S. Census records. It was a young neighborhood. The average age was 23. 69% of the residents were identified as black. 31% were white. The census records also show black residents had limited job opportunities.
A lot of times, especially in the early records, they just list them as laborers, or for the males, even some of the females were often listed as cooks, servants. When you get into around the turn of the century, that's when you start to see some of the details. They were tenners, janitors, they were doorsmen. Some of the women were seamstresses. They even started saying that they owned some of their own businesses. But a lot of the bigger businesses, such as the railroad companies or the tobacco factories, were the employers in Davis Bottom.
Flooding dictated the development of homes in Davis Bottom. The first homes were built on the highest ground. Some areas were never developed due to high water. Archaeologists hoped excavations would provide details about early residential life. However, all of the sites from the late 1800s were impacted by decades of flooding and construction.
When things get churned up, as we call it, if things get disturbed, somebody puts in a utility line or something, it mixes up all the artifacts. And so you no longer have that temporal control, so to speak, in trying to associate various events or various activities or various occupants. And so you're limited in that way. So for archaeologists in general, context is crucial.
We actually had several examples of artifacts that certainly could have been manufactured as early as, I would say, even 1860, 1880. We had medicine bottles that certainly could have dated as early as 1875, 1880. This is a piece of whiteware with a maker's mark, and this maker's mark may have dated as early as 1847. They did use it into the early 20th century. However, because it was recovered in a disturbed context, it makes it really difficult to say exactly when it was used, and that was really typical of some of the early artifacts that we did find at Davis Bottom.
There are only a few biographical records about the first generation in Davis Bottom. The most detailed accounts come from the Hathaway family. Robert Elijah Hathaway worked as a waiter before finding his true calling as a Christian preacher. His wife, Rachel, had 3 children, Fanny, Eva, and Isaac, before her untimely death in 1874. Robert made sure his children received an education. Fanny became a prominent teacher and principal. Eva became a nurse. And Isaac Scott Hathaway became a nationally recognized sculptor and professor.
We know that Isaac as a child was a very talented young man. He was already drawing and painting and experimenting with plaster and clay. Robert Elijah, Isaac's father, recognized this and supported it. They sent him to a school, the Lexington Normal Institute, where teachers had an appreciation for art education as well as the basics, seeing that these children knew their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. So he was surrounded by people who understood the value of art education.
While at the Institute, Isaac received the nickname Big Boots. Money was so tight, he wore his father's old Army brogans to school. Isaac excelled in all of his classes. His artistic career was molded at the age of 9 during a trip to Ohio. In 1881, Robert and Isaac Hathaway visited an art exhibit in Cincinnati. The exhibit featured marble and bronze sculptures of important figures from American history. Isaac wandered off in search of a bust of his hero, Frederick Douglass.
When his father finally found him in this museum, he said to him, as most parents would, "Why did you leave us? Why weren't you here with us?" And Isaac says to his father, "I was looking for a statue of Frederick Douglass because my teacher said all important people are in bronze." He could not find an image of Frederick Douglass. Isaac's father said to him, "Well, there are no Negro sculptures." And Isaac says, "I'm going to make busts of Negro people and put them where everybody can see them." I can't imagine how many 9-year-olds do I know, do you know, that would make this statement and stick to it. Given the time frame, 1881, we're still dealing with antebellum sentiment. Not having a role model to follow, truly knowing what the economic situation of the family was, not being able to afford art lessons. How was he going to do this? How did he do it?
After graduating from high school, Isaac worked as an English teacher. He also earned money illustrating medical textbooks and painting racehorses. This portrait of Queen Bon is the only one known to have survived. Hathaway used his art commissions to pay for higher education, not only for himself, but also for his 2 sisters. In 1894, Isaac studied drawing and painting at the New England Conservatory in Boston. In 1899, he took more studio courses at the Art Academy of Cincinnati.
Almost everyone speaks of his quiet determination, his dedication to what he was doing, his self-belief. He had to believe in himself in order to get this far. His support of his family, he couldn't have continued on in his art career without the support of his family. But I just think he was very determined, not in an aggressive way, in a very quiet, assertive way. And he didn't let the era of racism, of Jim Crow laws, stop him.
When combined, all of the research lines begin to form a picture about life in Davis Bottom during the late 1800s. Davis Bottom had a lot to offer young families. There was greater security and better access to health care and education. The Freedmen's Bureau, benevolent societies, missions, and churches provided most of these social services. Many Davis Bottom residents attended nearby Pleasant Green Baptist Church. In 1874, Pleasant Green started one of Lexington's first schools for African American students.
Although from an archaeological perspective, we don't know a lot about those daily life ways, at least from my investigations. It seemed to be an inclusive neighborhood. The archival suggests that they were going to churches nearby, they had their own schools, and it's just a close-knit community that it seemed that not a lot of people in the rest of Lexington really knew about it. It was its own neighborhood with its own flourishing families.
At the turn of the century, paved roads, sidewalks, electric lights, water lines, indoor plumbing, and telephones began to appear in downtown Lexington. Only a few of these modern conveniences found their way to Davis Bottom. Nevertheless, this diverse neighborhood became the destination for another wave of urban immigration. The second generation in Davis Bottom saw technological changes their parents could have only imagined. Automobiles, airplanes, movies, and radio transformed American life at the turn of the century. The popularity of a new cash crop, white burley tobacco, transformed Lexington's economy. By 1910, Lexington had the world's largest tobacco market. The growth in jobs at tobacco redryers, stemmers, and warehouses began to change the demographics of Davis Bottom.
Unlike other postbellum African-American urban clusters, it started out very segregated, but over time, it actually became more equal in terms of percentage of African Americans to whites. In 1900, I think there were about 62% African American, and in 1930, there were a little over half. So there is a shift, and actually, as you continue into the mid to late 20th century, you see continued increase of whites living there because of the migration of Eastern Kentucky families into the area, which dramatically changed the demographics of the neighborhood.
Over the past 10 years, scholars have been compiling records on nearly every home and building in Davis Bottom. Using field surveys and archival research, the scholars are documenting the neighborhood's historic architecture, including the most common style of home, the shotgun house. This rectangular house form can be found in most of Kentucky's urban communities. Shotgun houses are typically 1 room wide, 2 or 3 rooms deep, and 1 story high. They fit into narrow lots, which allows for the construction of more homes along urban streets.
I think it's important to document the structures of working class communities because even though they may not seem to be architecturally ornate or grand structures, they reveal a great deal about the people who lived in those communities who were so important to the industries that surrounded them and had their own stories to tell that a lot of times are forgotten about.
When we grew up, we were in a 1, 2, 3 room house. The living room, a middle room, and a kitchen. We didn't have inside running water. We had an outhouse.
We only had 1 bedroom. My mom, my dad, we'd maybe have a little cot, or some would sleep on pallets. You know, my mom would take blankets and make us a pallet, and that's how we slept. We always managed.
The population of Davis Bottom peaked at about 1,050 residents between 1910 and 1920. During this time, public schools began to play a vital role in the lives of residents. Schools were segregated. Black students attended Patterson Street School, which was built in 1896 with funds raised by Pleasant Green Church. The 2-story school, located just 20 feet from rail tracks, shook whenever a freight train passed. Patterson was demolished when George Washington Carver Elementary School was built in 1934. Constructed by the Works Progress Administration, Carver served thousands of neighborhood students until it was closed in 1972. Today, the building holds the Carver Community Center. Fanny Hathaway White, Isaac Hathaway's sister, worked as a teacher and principal at both Patterson and Carver during her long, distinguished career in education. White students attended Abraham Lincoln Elementary School, located just beyond the viaduct in Irishtown. Opened in 1912, Lincoln had exemplary programs and facilities, vocational training, an open-air roof, lunch programs, a Montessori kindergarten, and evening classes for adults. Lincoln was demolished in the 1970s, but residents recall that during tough economic times, the school was a lifeline.
It was a good school. They gave out to needy kids. I mean, the whole school gave lunch. No child or nobody had to pay for any lunch. And you know, and all of us down here, you know, their parents couldn't afford to pay for nothing like that because they barely could make it, you know. But nobody went hungry.
One of the most important institutions in Davis Bottom is the Nathaniel United Methodist Mission. Born during the Great Depression, Nathaniel Mission has served local residents and the homeless for over 80 years.
Well, it is our understanding that Nathaniel Mission was founded either in the late 20s or in the mid-30s as a group of Asbury Seminary students came up from Wilmore every Sunday morning honking their horns to get people out to worship on the hillside by the abandoned railroad track now. It was primarily founded as a spiritual endeavor. At some point, First United Methodist Church in Lexington kind of took it over. We moved into a building and it became a spiritual worship center as well as providing for physical needs as clothing and food for the residents in Davis Bottom, which were truly, truly on the margins with no safety net.
Nathaniel Mission served not only the residents of Davis Bottom, but also a large number of homeless men, women, and children who camped in the woods near the train tracks. In 1946, the mission moved into its present building, where it continues to provide spiritual, educational, and medical services.
In the clinic, we'll have a combined patient visit of last year of about 2,200 patient visits, and that's dentistry, vision, and medical. It includes our diabetes education classes also. On the mission church side of it, including worship services, our feeding programs is not limited just to folks without homes. We had 12,000 visits on the mission side of it last year.
Davis Bottom is known as a railroad town. Over the generations, numerous residents have worked as crew, laborers, freight handlers, cooks, and porters. The Cincinnati Southern Railroad had 2 facilities around Davis Bottom. Built in 1908, a large passenger station served the famous Queen and Crescent route, which ran from Cincinnati to New Orleans. The Cincinnati Southern also had a freight operation off Broadway. Built in 1881, this ornate wooden freight depot handled the railroad's commercial cargo. In the 1920s, the wooden structure was replaced by a large concrete building to better serve the tobacco trade.
The second freight depot was a reinforced concrete structure built in 1925 and very minimalist Art Deco style. The surface was concrete and it had small chevron decorations, but other than that, it was very plain, 2-story structure. It would have been a place of employment for many of the residents. It was also located amongst the tobacco warehouses and factories where we know that many of the residents were employed.
The Cincinnati Southern Freight Depot closed in 1956. The building served as a warehouse until destroyed by a fire in 2007.
The Cincinnati Southern Freight Depot was significant. More recently is Lexington's last remaining piece of railroad history. Looking at the photos that we have of the building, especially in its later years, it doesn't appear to be the most architecturally significant building, but its role in the neighborhood and within the larger rail system was very vital. And its role in the history of the railroad in Lexington is something that needs to be remembered.
When the circus came to town, they unloaded there. They would come in, late at night and unload and parade up to Red Mile. It wasn't an official parade, it was a working parade. The elephants were pulling wagons and so forth, and they would set up the big top, and we kids would help with all that and get free passes to the circus. They would come in that night, and by 1 o'clock the next day, they were up and going. So, of course, the whole neighborhood would be out at midnight to watch the circus come in.
Flooding and construction impacted most of the archaeological sites in Davis Bottom. But in the winter of 2010, Dr. Faberson discovered intact privies behind 2 shotgun homes built on DeRode Street in the 1920s. Archaeologists found a wood-lined privy behind one lot. A week later, the team uncovered another privy lined with slate salvaged from old pool tables.
We had approximately 38,000 artifacts that were recovered during the entire project from areas 3 and 5, and roughly 20,000 of those artifacts came just from the privies.
The materials recovered from Davis Bottom were taken to cultural resource analysts in Lexington. Here, staff members carefully washed, cataloged, and researched the entire collection.
I think the most intriguing thing to me was just the large variety of artifacts that came from the privies with such wide date ranges. It is really, really typical to find a site, especially a site that's had a really long period of use, to find artifacts from an early period all the way until a late period. But for these particular privies, we were finding artifacts that could have been manufactured as early as 1880, and then artifacts that were dated to 2006. It just really suggests that the people that were living there were probably salvaging items and using them over a long period of time.
What I at least see from a professional perspective is looking at a combination of the archival evidence with the archaeological evidence is that in spite of the challenges these people were facing, we do see some common factors. We see them doing things like picking raspberries and strawberries, and they're probably growing tomatoes, and they're canning them, and they're having fish fries, and they're doing things that, to me at least, and although we don't have a lot of evidence, to me at least establishes what I've read in newspaper articles, et cetera, that says this was still a tight-knit community. There was still a lot of cohesion there. In spite of everything, they stuck together.
In the year 1900, Isaac Hathaway returned to Davis Bottom. Isaac and his father, Robert, set up an art studio in the chicken coop behind their house on West Pine Street.
If anybody knows anything about a chicken coop, it's not a place I set up as a studio, but that's what was available to him. So he and his father probably cleaned out the chicken coop and put a new roof on it, put siding on it to protect it from the weather, and that's where he worked.
Hathaway secured commissions from a variety of patrons and institutions. He cast a series of life and death masks and created plaster models for Transylvania University and the Smithsonian Institution. His artistic skill made national news when he reconstructed the tree from a crime scene for a court case.
He was accused of having mutilated the death scene, and when the opposing attorney went to prove that he had mutilated the death scene, he stabbed the tree trunk with a knife, and when he pulled it out, it was plaster Paris. So not only had he created the scene just as he was supposed to, but he had colorized it enough that he convinced everybody, or made them believe, that it was the actual scene.
In 1907, Isaac Hathaway moved to Washington, D.C. He established the Afro Art Company, earning commissions from numerous federal agencies and museums. Hathaway also began creating his signature work. Fulfilling his childhood promise, Hathaway cast a series of busts depicting African-American leaders, such as Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, Bishop Richard Allen, and poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. The 12-inch busts sold for $1. Hathaway even provided an installment plan.
You have to understand, time was very difficult for most people. They didn't have money to waste buying a statue or buying a work of art, and to make these affordable. And they were well crafted. And for people to own something, even though it was plaster, they were painted with bronze color, and it made it look like real bronze, and it made people feel like they owned something. But it also gave them a chance to look at someone that they idolized.
Isaac Hathaway made another big career change in 1915. He left Washington, D.C. to establish the ceramics program at Branch Normal College, which is now the University of Arkansas, Pine Bluff.
Isaac Hathaway was not only concerned about developing his own skills, but also furthering the information and knowledge among other blacks. And he found the college and university was a proving ground for a lot of the information and research he had done in sculpture and ceramics.
Hathaway continued to teach, experiment with clays, and create his own artwork. He became known as the Dean of Negro Ceramicists for establishing numerous programs at Southern colleges. During his long career, the U.S. Mint commissioned Hathaway to design 2 commemorative coins. In 1946, he created the Booker T. Washington $50, the first U.S. coin to depict an African American. In 1951, Hathaway designed a second $50 with profiles of both Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. Hathaway and Carver became close friends when they both taught at the Tuskegee Institute.
He inspired his students to understand they can be whatever they want to be. And during the 30s and 40s, he's a black man trying to make a living, to carve out a living as an artist. But he set by example that you can make a living even in the arts.
In 1940, a WPA photographer took this rare photograph of the shotgun homes along DeRoday Street. That same year, Van Daren Koch took 2 more photographs of Davis Bottom. These 3 rare images captured Davis Bottom at an historical crossroad. The Great Depression would soon end with America's entry into World War II. Lexington's economy grew with wartime industries, but the population of Davis Bottom steadily declined. The neighborhood was zoned for industrial use. Hundreds of homes were demolished for factories and warehouses. Yet many residents hold positive memories from this time period. They remember Davis Bottom as a tight-knit community where the word neighbor meant everything. Lexington, like all of America, experienced enormous social and economic changes in the second half of the 20th century. During this period, Davis Bottom both reflected and defied national trends. As families moved to new suburbs, many Davis Bottom residents stayed put. During conflicts over civil rights, Davis Bottom remained an integrated neighborhood. When technology fueled the information age, Davis Bottom neighbors retained ageless values. Throughout this period, Davis Bottom became more and more neglected. The Newtown Pike Extension project was a contributing factor. Originally proposed in the 1930s, the roadway was designed to alleviate downtown traffic. But construction was delayed for 8 decades due to the lack of funding, local opposition, and legal challenges. Uncertainty about the construction project left Davis Bottom in limbo. There were few home and street improvements. DeRodes Street never had sidewalks. Yet, despite trying times, the spirit of this neighborhood endured. Today, scholars are interviewing those who know Davis Bottom best.
I remember the old store underneath of the bridge, about that bridge. It was Mr. Hank's store.
Well, some of the people live in tents.
The history of Davis Bottom is also found within the memories of residents.
My mother came from Pendleton County, which is up north, and my father came from Berthoud County.
I can remember my dad talking about his father who could play a fiddle.
Family traditions handed down through the generations.
Kincaid Coal Company had 3 little shotgun houses, and we rented one of them. That's where I lived.
In the summertime, we didn't have no fans, and it sure was no air conditions back then.
I remember in the summertime sleeping out on the porch. Loved it.
And first-hand accounts about life in the Bottom.
It was a lot of fun down here, and everybody was just like family, really, you'll know the truth.
In Davis Bottom, we didn't have everything that we wanted, but we had everything that we needed.
Oral histories are another way scholars and residents are preserving the legacy of Davis Bottom.
I think oral history has a huge role in our consideration of the past. At a very general level, it provides a different source of data, often filling in gaps that we cannot reach using the standard documentary history records such as tax records and deeds and written histories, even diaries and letters. Related but slightly different is the fact that oral history also allows us to greatly increase the range of perspectives that can be brought into the conversation on the past.
Numerous residents have generously contributed family photographs and memories to the Davis Bottom History Preservation Project. These rare materials will become a precious resource for residents, researchers, educators, and students. The interviews reveal that despite economic hardships, Davis Bottom was an incredibly diverse, safe, and close neighborhood.
I remember this being a real tight-knit neighborhood when we was growing up. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody cared about everybody.
Well, I loved living down here. I loved everybody around here because they was real friendly and everybody was close. And all of us just grew up together. It was fun going to school and playing with kids around here and everything. We just had a ball.
I was talking to people about doing history and stuff down here, and there's people that's lived next door to people for years and years that's not, they don't even know their names. We know their names, we've sat up with them, we've cried with them, we've partied with them, we've laughed with them, we've prayed with them.
Well, it's a loving place to live, and everybody lives here as sweet as they can be. And they help each other and everything. And they're just, you know, good to people, really good to people.
You can guarantee your neighbor would be right there. If something happened, your neighbor would be right there to sit there and hold your hand.
It's just a homey community. Now, that's what it's all about.
It was like family. It wasn't just like your own relatives. It was more like the whole neighborhood was a family.
They talk about integration. We were already integrated. Blacks and whites lived next door to each other. We played with each other. We ate with each other.
Race, it didn't make any difference what color you were. You were welcome in anybody's house on the street. All the older people down here, didn't matter who you were, where you were from. If they thought you were doing something wrong, you get corrected, and then they go tell your parents.
Everybody did look out for each other. Put it this way, if you did something wrong, your parents knew about it before you got home. Everybody could not wait for the summer, for the games to start. Most of it was like a big old family reunion.
Oral histories also provide insights about daily life, neighborhood events that rarely make history books, including summers at the ballpark.
I can hear the sounds right now, and I can, just in my mind's eye, I can see how the kids running and playing and everybody sharing food, picnicking, and the games going on from early morning until sundown. It was just absolutely the best atmosphere ever.
They had music, and me and my husband at the time were dancing down around our 20th anniversary, and they played music.
And the ball games brought back people that we may not have got to see for many years, but once they realized there was ball games going on down here, it brought a whole lot of people back to the neighborhood.
People from all over Lexington, and people would come from out of town.
Plus they bring teams from out of town to play the local teams.
People would come from Louisville or Cincinnati to these games sometimes.
The park was very, very important. It kept this community a community until the park shut down. That's when we kind of lost contact with a whole lot of folks.
We lived at 833 DeRoe Street, or he did.
He did, okay. Working class communities have been the focus of much of the recent research in social history, but yet they're still often underrepresented in the documentary record. And so oral history sometimes is the only way to reach some of the experiences of these communities. And I think especially if you think about the fact that so large a percentage of our population in this country grew up in working class communities, it means we have a huge audience out there that can potentially relate to these experiences as they're shared by the residents of Davis Bottom and similar communities.
In 1963, Isaac Hathaway retired from Alabama State College. He returned to Tuskegee, where he maintained a home studio until his death at the age of 95. Over the course of his long career, Hathaway memorialized over 100 African-American leaders. He broke numerous racial barriers, helped establish ceramics departments at 6 colleges, earned a host of national and international distinctions, and influenced countless students. Several institutions are preserving Hathaway's incredible legacy, including the University of Arkansas, Pine Bluff.
Hathaway, he had to be viewed on many planes. He was an artist, he was a scientist, he was I would say a chronicler of history. He was a historian that he left for all to see what many of these people look like. But he was a craftsman of the first order. I mean, he mastered the craft.
The Mosaic Templars Cultural Center also preserves Hathaway's artwork and professional papers. This extensive collection has been transformed into a popular exhibit entitled Capturing Greatness.
He met a lot of his contemporaries and he preserved their images.
and art. And so he is, to me, a unsung hero of African American history. He is a undiscovered treasure for not just African American history, not just Arkansas or Alabama or Kentucky history, but for the entire United States. And it's a history that we are proudly telling here at the Mosaic Templars Cultural Center.
Back in Lexington, the Isaac Scott Hathaway Museum is preserving the life of a favorite son through research, exhibits, and educational programs. Once the Newtown Pike project is complete, the museum plans to build a memorial park on the site of Hathaway's childhood home.
This small man from Davis Bottom, one of the lower-lying parts of Lexington, no one ever thought anybody of importance could have ever come out of Davis Bottom, and he did. Very quiet, very assertive young man that rose out of a time period when this wasn't supposed to happen. He had no role models, had none. His family economically wasn't of the upper middle class African American. It's just an amazing story.
In 2007, government officials approved a final plan for the Newtown Pike extension. Under the plan, the road is being built in phases. Displaced residents have been provided temporary homes within Davis Bottom, and the Lexington Community Land Trust is helping residents purchase new homes in what will become the South End Park Urban Village. Davis Bottom has changed forever. Yet the history of this remarkable neighborhood has been preserved for future generations.
Well, oral history is often done as its own undertaking, very successfully. But I think when it's done in conjunction with other investigations, anthropology, history, architectural history, material culture studies, we can get a sort of synergistic effect where the whole that we achieve is much richer than the sum of all the parts.
It is so important for us to put that anthropological, what we would call, or the human face on the neighborhood, and it's important to tie in that past then with the present day, with the people who still live there now or who lived there recently, and we can tell a story about the neighborhood that we couldn't do otherwise without having this archaeological data.
I think it's really important to take a look at history. It says a lot about who we are and who we've become as people now.
The settlement of Davis Bottom was important to the growth of Lexington. It coincided with expansion of industry, expansion of the railroad, expansion of the tobacco industry, certainly.
You can learn so much from the people that lived and worked there. And I think if you're able to learn about a neighborhood, you begin to appreciate it. And that's when it becomes alive.
I think Isaac should be as well known as any other artist that was from Kentucky.
It is a rich history and a long history. So to preserve it means that our children's children will have an opportunity to learn and grow and benefit from the groundwork that's been laid here.
It's as vital to Lexington as Marytown Lincoln's house was. And our people, our folks, our neighbors cannot experience transformation if they don't have a grounding in knowing who they are. And I think that's important.
More information and educational resources are available on the Davis Bottom Companion website.